Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show that gives you the shortcut to being truly well-informed. Today, we're on a pretty profound intellectual journey, I think. We're getting into history, geography, ideology, all of it.
We really are. We're tackling this huge concept, one that the sources you sent over define as Civilizational Universalism, or in the original, Ichuyi.
And it's an important term to get right. We're not just talking about empires building roads and conquering territory.
No, not at all. This is about the mechanism, the process by which a local culture manages to transform itself into a truly global unit. Something so compelling, so ideologically strong that it goes beyond race, beyond language, even beyond geography.
It doesn't just conquer, it actually defines reality for millions of people.
It defines the mental framework, exactly.
Yeah.
And our mission today is to, pull out the patterns, the intellectual debts which are often hidden or even denied, and the really astonishing cyclical nature of these universalisms.
Especially the ones centered around the Mediterranean.
Right. And our source material identifies three great ones in human history that really pulled off this global shift. You've got the Greek universalism, then the first Islamic universalism, and finally the contemporary European one.
The first thing that just jumps off the page is the geography of it all. This isn't random.
Not at all. It's geographically contained. All three of these massive civilizational peaks popped up around the Mediterranean basin.
And they cycle, don't they, between the northern and southern shores?
Predictably. It's like the sources see the Mediterranean as a kind of consistent laboratory where the raw materials of global culture are tested and refined and then passed on. The energy literally shifts from the northeast to the southeast and then up to the northwest.
Always anchored to that basin.
Always.
But even more important than the where is the how. The material points to this specific, repeatable pattern that dictates the life, and I guess the death, of these universalisms. It's this powerful, almost tragic two-act play.
It is. Act one is always this phase of intense, brilliant, original thought and creativity, the idea-driven civilization. This is where the new science, the philosophy, the art, it's all generated here.
And it doesn't last.
It's inherently unstable, and it always leads to Act two, the rise of a successor state that is purely military-focused.
A successor that isn't creative itself.
Precisely. This successor state, it takes all the intellectual achievements wholesale, but then it slams the brakes on all internal innovation. It becomes what the sources call a massive iron block.
Focused only on expansion and force.
That's its only job. Inquiry and philosophy are over. It's just consolidation and military might.
Okay, let's unpack that succession model because it's presented as less of a sequence of, unrelated empires and more like a single machine that just keeps running over and over again.
The sources map it out as a really detailed four-stage process. Stage one is the start, the initiation. The civilization kicks off in a specific spot in the Mediterranean, and you just see this explosion of arts, sciences, thought.
Like Athens or Baghdad or maybe Renaissance Florence.
Exactly, those places. Then stage two is where the real magic happens, the creation of what you could call the universal mental map.
The reference point.
Yes, the civilization creates a reference point. This could be a language like Greek or Arabic, or it could be a set of philosophical systems that become the foundational language for understanding reality itself.
And once that's set, everyone else has to play on that field.
They have to use its terms to structure their own worldview. Then comes stage three, the military transfer. This powerful military state emerges, but, and this is critical, it always comes from the peoples who were originally on the outside.
The ones who were subsumed by the creative civilization.
So-called barbarians, who absorbed the culture but kept their martial strength. And stage four reveals the successor's real function. It's a preserver. It's a military shell.
So it adopts all philosophy and science.
Right. It internalizes the reference point, uses it for governance, but, and this is the key, it completely stops innovating. No new science, no new philosophy. All its energy goes into military expansion. It becomes that massive iron block.
So the military state's job is basically to militarize and protect the ideas it inherited, but it doesn't have the fuel to keep those ideas evolving.
You've got it. When the intellectual core is exhausted, the military successor steps in. Its job is to hold the borders, not expand the mind. The military becomes everything, the army, the government, the entire structure.
The implication here really goes against a lot of modern political theory, doesn't it? It suggests history isn't about coexistence or even the clash of civilizations we hear so much about.
Well, the sources are really vehement on this point. They say history is defined by civilizational hegemony. These things don't happily coexist. One universalism has to dominate and set the terms for reality until it's eventually displaced by the next more powerful idea.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because now we can apply this four-stage model to the first big example, the Greek universalism. Hashtag the Greek universalism and the military bloc successor.
So the Greek universalism, it pops up in the Northeast Mediterranean. Its reference point, its global frame was the Greek language and, most importantly, its philosophical systems.
And the sources point out its specific geographic reach. It covered the Mediterranean peoples, the Near East, but, and this is surprising, Western Europe was initially outside its scope.
Right. We think of Greece as the foundation of the West, but at first it was very much oriented east and south.
And what's crucial here is that even though the Greeks took over huge territories like Persia and India, those places didn't really contribute any original thought that changed the Greek paradigm.
No, they were consumers of the intellectual product, not co-creators. It really shows how centralized this whole process is. The engine room of renewal always seems to be right there at that meeting point of three continents around the Med.
But the creative part for the Greeks, it was surprisingly short.
Incredibly short-lived and intense. The sources argue that Greek science and brilliance were, luminous for a very brief period, peaking around Aristotle's time. And then, poof, it died out quickly under the weight of myth as the Roman era started.
As soon as the political structure shifted, the light just went out.
It faded fast. And that's when Rome steps in, perfectly playing the part of the military successor.
The massive iron block.
The absolute quintessential massive iron block. Yeah. Rome was this enormous military state, ruthlessly efficient with roads, aqueducts, administration, but it was completely devoid of original intellectual or scientific evolution.
So it took the Greek framework but added nothing new to the core ideas.
Exactly.
But hold on, the sources say Roman political maturity took 1,000 years. Doesn't that suggest they did more than just be a military bloc? What were their innovations?
That's a fair point. The sources would argue that Roman innovation was purely applied. They were masters of engineering, of legal codification for a sprawling empire, of military organization. They were logistical geniuses.
They didn't produce a Plato.
Or an Archimedes or a Ptolemy. Not from their own intellectual well. Their law was functional. Their science was borrowed. They just built the political shell to protect and spread the Greek ideas they inherited.
And the Greeks themselves were very aware of this imbalance. There's that great anecdote about the contempt they had for their conquerors.
Oh, the contempt was visceral. They saw the Romans as crude barbarians. They constantly insulted them, calling them opikoi, which basically means ignorant and vulgar.
Like they were saying, you can hold a sword to our throats, but you're still intellectual savages.
That's exactly the dynamic. And it wasn't just, casual snobbery. The sources talk about how much this stung the Roman elite.
Right, with the Senator Marcus Cato.
Exactly. He complained about how the Greeks shamed the Romans. They used terms like opic so much that Roman officials felt they had to imitate Greek culture, study their rhetoric, adopt their dress, just to seem cultured.
It's a perfect example of how military control doesn't equal cultural control. Rome had the power, but Greece still owned the reference point. Hashtag challenging the myth of Greek originality. That sets us up perfectly for one of the most provocative claims in the material. This idea that we need to challenge the whole myth of Greek originality, what the sources call the imperialism of statements.
This imperialism of statements, just move there, is that standard Western narrative that says all of culture flows from this single miraculous Greek and Western genius. It just flattens or denies the huge intellectual heritage that came before.
That's a massive claim. How do the sources back that up? How do they argue the Greeks weren't the originators we think they were?
They bring up the lifelong struggle of the Danish scientist Otto Neubauer. He spent his entire career trying to connect Greek science, especially astronomy and math, to what came before in Mesopotamia and North Africa.
And he met with resistance.
Fierce, almost emotional opposition. Neubauer's conclusion was that 2,500 years of scientific achievement happened before the Greeks even showed up. They arrived in the middle of a long story, not at the beginning.
So the Greeks weren't so much inventors as they were brilliant record keepers and communicators.
That's the argument. Their secret weapon was a piece of technology, literacy, which they got from the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were traders. They didn't use writing to archive philosophy. But the Greeks used it to systematically record and catalog all the human knowledge they found, most of it from North Africa and Mesopotamia.
And by organizing it, they made it universal.
They crystallized it. And if you look at specific fields, the depth becomes really obvious.
For example?
Well, the material quotes the French scholar Pierre Rossi. He argued that Greek scholarship, even with its Greek scientific language, was entirely Arabic in its lineage. Its roots were in Egypt or Asia Minor. Think about the big names: Archimedes, Euclid, Diophantus. The sources point out that they're often cited as being Egyptian or Syracusan, not Athenian. They inherited knowledge systems that were already ancient.
What about the natural sciences?
Take Aristotle. We admire his detailed zoology, botany, and so on. But the sources say those classification systems came from Mesopotamia. Scholars there had already classified thousands of plants and animals millennia before him. Aristotle compiled it, systematized it, and recorded it in Greek.
The science was Eastern, but the intellectual infrastructure became Greek. But what about philosophy? That's the heart of Greek identity, surely.
Even there, the material suggests a strong link to ancient Eastern thought. And this is where it gets really fascinating linguistically. The sources break down the word philosophos as a lover of wisdom.
Philosophus.
Right. They suggest the sophos part is linked to the Arabic concept of a Sufi.
So philosophus as philosophy, how does that work?
Well, the sources connect sophos to the Arabic concept of kushuf, which means intuition, revelation, or Gnosticism. It's that spiritual inner knowledge you associate with Sufism. So Sophia, or wisdom, isn't just about rational deduction, the logos, which is how the West sees it. It's about this Eastern spiritual insight.
Okay, so if the idea comes from Kushif, it means ultimate reality is accessed through intuition, maybe divine inspiration, and not just the pure logical thought we associate with Plato and Aristotle.
Exactly. It completely reframes the foundation of Western thought. The argument is that true wisdom comes from the heart, a spiritual state. The Greeks were essentially codifying and organizing a spiritual quest that already existed in the East. They gave it a rational framework, but they left out the source of the wisdom, the unseen.
And that omission, the sources will argue later, is what ultimately doomed their civilization.
It's the piece they couldn't integrate. And that sets the stage perfectly for the next civilization to absorb their catalog knowledge and reconnect it with that missing divine piece. We just have to move across the Mediterranean to the southern shore. Hashtag the first Islamic Universalism, the idea-driven civilization. And that brings us to the second major universalism, the first Islamic Universalism. And unlike the Roman model, which was built on force, this one was profoundly systemically idea-driven.
Its scope was incredible. I mean, a global religious civilization stretching from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific.
Covering that whole traditional basin of civilizations. And its reference point was completely unique. It was the Arabic language and the Islamic religion, with the Quran as the central ideological core, which critically reviewed and corrected and ultimately dominated all the religious legacies that came before it.
And geographically, it's right there in the cycle originating in the Southeast Mediterranean, directly opposite the Greeks.
The north-to-south pattern continues. But the sources make this really sharp contrast when it comes to speed and longevity. It highlights the huge difference between a civilization built on an idea versus one built on pure military power.
Right. The Roman Empire took 1,000 years to build itself up.
1,000 years of exploitation and brute force. And yet its final collapse against the Goths and Huns was incredibly fast, a century, and it was gone.
And the Islamic Universalism.
It reached its peak with incredible speed, something like 80 years. It spread out of the Arabian Peninsula primarily by the word and the idea. It wasn't just conquest. It was establishing centers of learning, trade, law that offered people stability and opportunity.
And its resilience, its ability to last, says a lot about the strength of that idea.
It survived threats that would have just shattered Rome. I mean, the Mongol invasions in the 13th century were far more devastating than anything Rome ever faced. But the Islamic socio-political system survived for over 1,200 years.
Right up until the caliphate was abolished in 1924.
That resilience, the sources argue, is the fundamental difference. It's what happens when a structure is built by principle and enlightened minds versus one built purely by force.
So what about the sources of knowledge during this Islamic Golden Age? Was it just based on the Greek framework it inherited, as you sometimes hear in Western accounts?
Oh, not at all. The sources really stress the diversity. The Abbasids systematically went out and found knowledge not just from the Greeks, though they preserved and developed Aristotle and Ptolemy, but also from the Indians for mathematics, the Persians for literature and governance, the Syrians.
They weren't just translating Greek, they were translating everything.
They translated the works of every sophisticated foreign culture they met, and crucially, the system was inclusive.
That seems to be its defining feature.
It really is. Islam actively worked to remove the Arab complex of superiority over foreigners. And that created this environment where people from any background, Indian, Persian, Berber, Turk, could participate and create.
And eventually rule.
Exactly. Non-Arabs rose to become sultans and kings. The civilization was genuinely a product of many nations, all bound together by this supranational identity of religion and the Arabic language.
But the inevitable cycle kicks in again. The creative phase ends, and the military successor state takes over.
And that successor was the Ottoman Turks. They became this unmatched military force, securing the Eastern Mediterranean from the 16th century on. But their rise marked the definitive end of the intellectual and scientific flourishing of the Islamic era.
It's a mirror image of Rome taking over from the Greeks.
It's the exact same pattern. The sources draw a really stark contrast. The Golden Age gave us Al-Biruni, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd. The Ottoman period, there's a real lack of major original thinkers.
The great architect Sinan is the one exception mentioned.
The one true genius. But scientifically, industrially, they were mostly just copying European industries. They weren't innovating. They were the iron block, protecting the borders, but not advancing the core ideas.
And yet, that iron block played a critical role against the rise of European colonialism.
A very critical role. The sources stress this protective function. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the Ottomans stood firm against an aggressive, expanding Europe. They blocked Portuguese incursions. They were a shield.
And the proof is what happened when that shield fell.
Tragically clear. The moment the Ottoman entity collapsed after World War I, the Arab world was immediately, systematically carved up and devoured by European colonialism. The collapse of the military bloc meant the end of the entire political framework.
And that historical cycle brings us to the third phase, the contemporary European Universalism. This one, arising in the Northwest Mediterranean, is defined by, well, its immense intellectual debt and its aggressive denial of that debt.
The sources outline its origin. Europe initially tried to put Christ at the forefront, aiming for a Christian universalism. But ultimately, the real defining figures became Faust and Prometheus.
Secular, materialistic figures, all about man's unchecked ambition and scientific power.
Exactly. And to really get the shock of the Renaissance, you have to look at the miserable context that came before it. The usual narrative of this sudden European genius kind of papers over that.
The sources paint a pretty bleak picture.
Truly bleak. A crushing feudal system, no social mobility, constant fear of natural disasters, the devastation of plagues like the Black Death. There was intense piety, but no spiritual security. Just superstition and a struggle to survive.
So the jump to the Renaissance wasn't some spontaneous internal combustion of genius.
The sources argue forcefully against that. They claim Europe's rise really began in the 12th century, and it was triggered not from within, but by an external intellectual invasion from the Islamic world.
An intellectual invasion, that's a strong term.
It created a genuine systemic crisis of acculturation within Christian Europe. It was this reintroduction of rationality, this huge flood of knowledge, rationalism, astronomy, math, medicine, philosophy peaked in the 13th century.
And the timing is critical.
It coincides precisely with the founding of the first European universities, the Sorbonne, Oxford, Bologna. These places were founded, in large part, to handle the massive volume of translations pouring in.
From where?
From translation centers that popped up in the interface zones. Toledo, Barcelona, Sicily, Venice. Their entire purpose was to transfer Islamic sciences, which included both preserved Greek texts and new Arabic works, into Latin. It was a complete download of centuries of knowledge.
But the sources say the human element was maybe even more important than the books.
Absolutely. After the Reconquista, when Catholic forces took over Andalusian cities, thousands of skilled Andalusian Muslim scholars, professionals, were exiled into Europe, especially France. They brought with them not just texts, but an entire enlightened Islamic culture.
And most importantly, the empirical scientific method.
Which was transformative for Europe. The sources claim these exiles gave Europe the critical tools it needed to analyze its own Christian heritage and its reliance on myth. It sparked a fundamental change in the Western intellectual structure. Before this, they struggled to square logic with theology. After this, they had a model for objective inquiry.
The shock was so big, the material says, that the history of Western thought basically splits into a before and after the Arab.
It's that significant.
Okay, let's touch on those really surprising anecdotal claims in the source material about the lingering Arabic influence on famous names. These are a bit hard to process for a Western audience.
They were bold, for sure. But the sources present them as evidence of just how deep this demographic and intellectual migration went. So you have the claims that the name William Shakespeare could be read as Ishak Espier or Margaret Thatcher as Thatchker, from the word Tajir, meaning merchant.
And the point isn't to prove that definitively.
No, the point they're making is that the infusion was so complete that it was absorbed right into the very nomenclature of later European power structures.
And philosophically, the sources talk about the sheer speed of the shock.
They cite the French historian Alain de Liberta, who called it a massive acculturation shock. Latin Europe got centuries of developed Islamic philosophy, Avicenna, Averroes, all compressed into just a few decades.
The Arabs had centuries to debate it. Europe had to absorb it almost overnight.
And it caused the intellectual center of gravity to shift immediately from Baghdad and Cordoba to places like Paris and Oxford.
Even Europe's legal system, specifically the Napoleonic Code, is claimed to have roots in this transfer.
This is a really powerful, detailed claim. The argument is that when Napoleon needed to unify his huge multi-ethnic empire, he couldn't find a comprehensive legal code in the fragmented European tradition.
So he looked elsewhere.
He turned to Islamic jurisprudence, specifically the Maliki school, which was dominant in North Africa.
Why that one in particular?
Because the Maliki school had been built over 1,000 years. It offered these ready-to-use, cataloged, indexed legal codes that covered everything: public, private, commercial life. It had a structure and detail that European common law just lacked.
So Napoleon's experts adapted it.
They adapted these meticulously cataloged principles, and that became the famous Napoleonic laws, which then became the foundation for civil law systems all across continental Europe.
What about the smaller claims, like the metric system?
The source asserts that even fundamental words we use for modern science, meter, liter, gram, are Arabic in origin, which suggests that even the basic tools of the modern world were derived from the same source.
So Europe gets this entire preserved and renewed world heritage from the Muslims, but then responds with what the sources call a strange racist denial. Why? Why not just acknowledge the debt?
This denial is explained as a deep psychological crisis. The sources cite Muhammad Assad, who said that European antagonism toward Islam is unique. It's not just indifference. It's this deep-seated emotional hatred that makes even so-called objective scholars, the Orientalists, abandon their impartiality.
But why specifically against Islam? They accepted influence from China or India in other areas.
Food Sezgin provides the explanation. The Latin Europeans were psychologically crushed by the fact that they had to take their knowledge, their science, their university system from their political and religious enemies, the Arabs.
Acknowledging that would have shattered their self-image.
It would have shattered their image as the sole divine successor to Rome and Greece. This sense of humiliation, the psychological burden, led to a policy of just outright denial. They rewrote history to claim their foundation was purely Hellenic and Roman, and they systematically erased the Arabic intellectual bridge.
Which sets the stage for the final part of the contemporary cycle, the military iron bloc successor to Europe. And that, of course, is the United States, hashtag the American successor, and the end of the cycle.
The sources place the U.S. perfectly within that historical cycle. It emerges as this massive military bloc after World War II, and that signals the inevitable end of the European civilizational cycle.
And just like Rome after Greece, the material really questions the idea of the U.S. as this independent, innovative civilization. It's more of an accumulator.
Right. American scientific dominance, the material argues, is heavily borrowed. The core intellectual capital was imported. Nikola Tesla was Serbian. The brain trust of Europe, Einstein. Fermi fled Nazism and went to America.
Even the Manhattan Project.
It was based on German work. The material's conclusion is that American success is built on adapting foreign capital, not on its own profound civilizational depth.
Mohammed Abu al-Qasim Hashemad makes this very clear, if a bit culturally biased, distinction between the European core and the US-USSR model.
He does. He argues that Western Europe is still the center of civilizational depth, where science has been mixed with life, with a human connection to existence, since the Enlightenment. The US and the old USSR, on the other hand, just took the iron horse, the technological output.
So they prioritized mechanical quantitative growth over civilizational ripening.
That's the idea. The analogy comparing American jazz to European Beethoven is a powerful way the source makes its point. European culture, like Beethoven or Schubert, is seen as growing organically over centuries of deep philosophical inquiry.
Whereas American culture is seen as technologically advanced, but maybe lacking that depth.
Right, like jazz or blockbuster films, highly consumable, but not integrated with existence in the same way. Hashemand's quote is pretty cutting. He says American orchestras are not equal to one string in old Vienna streets.
Emphasizing that material output isn't the same as true cultural depth. This view leads to a pretty stark prophecy about the American universalism.
They cite Oscar Wilde's famous quip as a kind of prologue. America is the only nation that will pass from barbarism to decadence without ever having been civilized.
But the source posits a very specific, very powerful indicator for when American dominance will actually end.
Yes, it identifies the ultimate sign that American economic and military dominance is over, the termination of Zionist Jewish aggression in Palestine by a rising Islamic power.
That's a severe claim, that the U.S. is not just an ally, but enslaved by global Zionism. How do the sources even define global Zionism here? And what's the evidence beyond that one Reagan quote?
Well, the sources define it as a non-territorial power structure that uses financial and media control to dictate U.S. foreign policy, essentially using American military might as its ultimate shield. They cite historical examples like Ronald Reagan's alleged quote about being willing to fight World War III for Israel as proof that U.S. policy puts Israeli security above its own strategic interests.
So the thesis is?
The thesis is stark. If the U.S., with all its military power, proves incapable of protecting Israel, its dominance will end almost overnight, because the core function of the American iron bloc, defending the current geopolitical order, will have failed.
The material then shifts from that geopolitical analysis to a moral critique. What's the final judgment on America's use of force, specifically at the end of World War II?
It's a very harsh critique. The sources point out that the U.S. is the only nation to have ever used nuclear weapons in war. They argue vehemently that bombing Japan was unnecessary, that the war was already ending, and that the act served no strategic purpose other than to demonstrate terrifying power.
And they label the historical justification for it as another example of that imperialism of statements.
Exactly. Where force is used to rewrite history and morality, it's a process that, according to the sources, turns scoundrels into crowned heroes. They identify the U.S. as the world's greatest current danger because of its institutionalized willingness to use massive, unjust force to maintain its hegemony. Hashtag the second age of ignorance, desegmentation.
Yeah, fragmentation. So, if the first Islamic universalism ended, and the European one is exhausted, and we're now in the American military successor phase, what happens in this interim period? The sources call it the second age of ignorance.
It's a direct and very weighty theological reference to the Quran, to Jahiliyyah Thanya. It contrasts the current state of the Islamic world with the Jahiliyyah Ula, the first age of ignorance before the rise of Islam. It signifies a profound regression.
And what are the characteristics of this second age of ignorance?
The material lists 4 core symptoms. First, Islam stops being the guiding reference point in public, political, and economic life. People start looking for non-Islamic, man-made alternatives. Second, the Islamic political entity is completely fragmented and weak.
And third is a kind of internal retreat.
A deep internal regression. Muslims fall back on old pre-Islamic identities, Arab nationalism, Pharaonism, Berberism, Persian identity. It separates Arabs from non-Arabs and breaks down national identities.
And the most bitter external sign of this collapse?
The establishment of the second Jewish state in Palestine. That is presented as the clearest, most definitive sign that the first historical cycle for Islamic Universalism is over. The failure to prevent that is the ultimate indicator of the current state of Jahiliyyah Thanya.
And internally, the Islamic world is locked in this massive ideological crisis, with 5 factions at war with each other. We should probably detail who these groups are.
This ideological battlefield is just paralyzing. The sources list these 5 factions. First, you've got the modernists, often secular intellectuals, who want to basically abolish religion's role in public life. They see it as an obstacle.
Then you have the secularists, who are different.
They don't want to abolish religion, but they want to rigidly confine it to the mosque and the home. Statecraft, law, economics. That should all be strictly man-made.
Compartmentalized. Then come the traditionalists.
These are the groups who want to immediately implement often harsh, specific legal judgments. It often leads to takfir, excommunication, internal splits. They're seen as rigid and divisive.
The fourth group is the eclectic Ikhwan movements, like the Muslim Brotherhood.
They're the compromisers. They try to patch together these different ideological streams, marrying modern political structures with religious guidance.
Yeah.
But the sources see them as eclectic, lacking a solid philosophical backbone to really challenge the whole Western framework.
And finally, the violent jihadi groups.
Right, groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, they're seen as this extremist reaction to the failure of everyone else, trying to get liberation through immediate, brutal violence, which just leads to more chaos and state suppression.
And this internal mess is only made worse by external pressures. Who's keeping this crisis going, according to the sources?
It's all compounded by dictatorship, military rule, and corruption. And these things are maintained, the sources argue, by an imperialist, Zionized global order that actively blocks any move toward real liberation or democracy.
So any unifying movement is immediately countered.
Through economic pressure, military intervention, or just propping up compliant dictators. But despite all this darkness, there's this firm belief in the role of divine law in history.
God hasn't exited history.
That's the theological anchor. The rise and fall of nations, including Europe's dramatic rise out of darkness, are all governed by the same divine law of empowerment, or ACAPia. God empowers nations to test their actions.
That brings us to the prediction of the future, the second Islamic Universalism. For this new universalism to succeed, it has to do what the West couldn't.
It has to achieve what the sources call absorption and transcendence. The new civilization has to first absorb all the positive scientific and intellectual heritage of the West, but then critically, it has to transcend the West's core limitations.
And the sources argue that China, for all its economic power, can't do this.
China's ruled out. Its model is just a modified version of Soviet materialist communism, totalitarian and soul-destroying. It's geographically distant from the Mediterranean centers of influence, and fundamentally, it can't offer a new way of thinking. It's built on the same materialist principles as the West.
It can't transcend the West because it shares the same philosophical limits. So why do the sources believe only Islam can achieve this transcendence? What does that even mean in practical terms?
It's rooted in its foundational structure, which rests on three inseparable dialectics: the unseen, man, and nature. Western civilization mastered the relationship between man and nature, but it deliberately cut out the unseen. And that led to materialism, moral decay, and global conflict.
So how does a civilization practically apply the dialectic of the unseen to science or government?
Well, transcendence means you link the search for knowledge back to its moral and spiritual source. In science, you'd reject the purely instrumental view of nature. You'd see scientific discovery as a reflection of divine order, not just a tool for exploitation or weapons.
And governance.
It means rejecting racial superiority, class conflict, and economic oppression. You'd replace them with a system, the supranational state, that gets its laws from a higher source of justice that applies to all of humanity, not just one race or nation.
To explain this progression, the sources use this powerful theological framework from Surat at-Tur to map out the prophetic stages of history.
It's a profound interpretation of these divine oaths. The first oath is Al-Tur, Mount Sinai. That represents the law given to Moses, the stage of Bani Israel. It anchors the start of monotheistic public law.
The next stage is signaled by a written book on a scroll.
This is the gospel delivered by Jesus. It's a necessary phase. But the sources point out that God gives no spatial marker for this phase. And that's significant. Because Jesus was rejected, his message never established a successful public divine society or a geographical center. It failed as a public universalism.
Then comes the first Islamic Universalism.
Signaled by the filled house, which refers to the Kaaba in Mecca. This was the universalism that brought Islam to the unlettered peoples, the Ummis. But the sources note this phase did not achieve full hegemony over the people of the book, the Christians and Jews.
And the future universalism, the second Islamic Universalism, is heralded by the next oath.
The raised ceiling. This represents the final stage where Islam will prevail over all religion, finally incorporating and achieving spiritual and judicial hegemony over the people of the book. This is the stage of complete absorption and transcendence.
And the final oath, the scorched sea, that's the sign of the very end of days.
The moment right before the resurrection. It's marked by catastrophic environmental events. Seas merge, the Earth's rotation reverses, continents are uprooted. The flowing lava that emerges is interpreted as Gog and Magog. This places the second Islamic Universalism as the absolute apex of human achievement before the end times.
An apex that includes literal space travel and discovering the secrets of energy.
Yes. The sources cite Quranic verses that promise humanity will discover energy secrets, control its power, and travel between stars. It's a vision of a civilization that achieves total mastery over nature, but integrated with the spiritual. The ultimate goal is that supranational state, the Islamic Universalism.
We should elaborate on that term, AUALECA. Is it a political union, a spiritual hegemony? How is it different from a caliphate or an empire?
The sources define it as an unprecedented structure. It's different from a traditional caliphate because it's not tied to a single dynasty or ethnic group. It's a unifying religious, political, and legal framework for all of humanity. Legally, it incorporates and supersedes all existing man-made laws. Politically, it's defined by two requirements: religious freedom and justice, making it fundamentally anti-imperialist, unlike the European model. Hashtag locating the center of the second universalism.
This incredible vision needs a center, a pivot point where this new universalism will begin. The sources give three specific criteria for finding this location.
First, it has to overlook the Mediterranean because of that persistent historical pattern. Second, it has to be an Arab state because Arabs are designated the middle nation for global witness. And third, the state must not be civilizationally exhausted.
So let's map out the exhaustion zones based on the cycle we've been talking about.
The northeast Mediterranean, Greece, was exhausted by the Greek Universalism. The southeast, Mecca and the Levant, was exhausted by the first Islamic Universalism. And the northwest, Europe, was exhausted by the contemporary European Universalism.
Which leaves only the southwest Mediterranean, the Maghreb.
Exactly. The geographic center of gravity has shifted from the traditional east to the west of the Arab world. The country that will take the lead has to be opposite Europe, close enough to absorb Western civilization completely, located on that southwest shore, and capable of generating the required intellectual energy.
And the sources identify one single location that meets all the criteria: Algeria.
Algeria is named because it's the only state in the Maghreb with the necessary human, geographical, and economic potential, especially its huge youth population and resources, to play this role. And the sources highlight that even the colonial powers knew about this potential.
How so?
They note that back in the 1970s, colonial intelligence identified only two Arab nations capable of industrial advance and real leadership: Iraq and Algeria. And the history of what happened to those two nations is very telling.
A history of deliberate, systematic crippling?
Iraq, the first center of potential, was destroyed by the 8-year war with Iran and then the U.S. invasion, which was famously threatened to send Iraq back to the Stone Age. The sources claim the U.S. deliberately handed Iraq over to Iran to ensure it was destroyed as an Arab power.
In Algeria.
Algeria was crippled by crushing external debt and then decimated by a Western-backed civil war, the Black Decade in the 1990s.
Right after an Islamic-led state was about to come to power.
The intervention was immediate. The moment the Islamic Salvation Front, or FIS, won the first round of elections, the process was stopped. The sources mention the anecdote about French President François Mitterrand, who, when he heard the news, allegedly told his soldiers to stop this folklore, signaling the direct external pressure to sabotage Algeria's democratic process.
The sources also definitively rule out Turkey as a leader for this second universalism.
Completely. Despite its religious population, modern Turkey is run by staunchly secular institutions and is totally dependent on the West, through NATO and hundreds of treaties. And crucially, the sources say the Turkish people are still deeply attached to nationalism and revere Ataturk, who they claim defied God.
So a return to a unifying Islamic universalism from Turkey is impossible.
It was the Turkish people who brought down the caliphate, not just external powers. So the sources see that as a settled question. #tagoutro.
This deep dive has offered a view of history that's just fundamentally cyclical, profoundly theological, and fiercely critical of our current Western narratives. The pattern is so clear: a burst of creative ideas, then a military iron block, then exhaustion, and the need for a new idea-driven paradigm.
And the sources contend that the West's failure was its inevitable, self-imposed pursuit of pure materialism. By abandoning the unseen, it only bred conflict, oppression, and denial. The future supranational state, the AUACA, will succeed because it transcends this materialism. It links the advancements of man and nature back to the governing reality of the unseen.
The entire cyclical view hinges on one final, crucial distinction: the difference between the people and the rulers.
Absolutely. The sources stress that the true capital of Islam is in the peoples, not the governments, which are often just propped up by the current global order. Civilizational change is driven by the peoples, by those who guide by the truth and establish justice by it. The collective popular consciousness is the real power source.
And we see this principle applied to history, too, not just theology.
The initial Islamic conquests weren't just by the sword. They were driven by oppressed peoples seeking liberation and embracing the idea. Similarly, Alexander the Great never would have succeeded if the local populations in Persia and India hadn't been willing to step aside and welcome him. Military strength is just the delivery mechanism. The consciousness of the masses is the real propellant.
So we'll leave you with this provocative closing thought. If the next inevitable universalism is going to be based on integrating the unseen, man, and nature, how does one prepare intellectually and spiritually for a future that demands a fundamental leap beyond the purely material worldview that dominates everything today?